Global sourcing is the practice of sourcing from the global market for goods and services across geopolitical boundaries. Global sourcing often aims to exploit global efficiencies in the delivery of a product or service. These efficiencies include low-cost skilled labor, low-cost raw material, and other economic factors like tax breaks and low trade tariffs. A large number of information technology projects and services, including its applications and mobile apps and database services, are outsourced globally to countries like Pakistan and India for more economical pricing. Common examples of globally sourced products or services include labor-intensive manufactured products produced using low-cost Chinese labor, call centers staffed with low-cost English-speaking workers in the Philippines and Pakistan and India, and IT work performed by low-cost programmers in India and Pakistan and Eastern Europe. While these examples are examples of low-cost country sourcing, global sourcing is not limited to low-cost countries. Majority of companies today strive to harness the potential of global sourcing in reducing cost. Hence it is commonly found that global sourcing initiatives and programs form an integral part of the strategic sourcing plan and procurement strategy of many multinational companies. Global sourcing is often associated with a centralized procurement strategy for a multinational, wherein a central buying organization seeks economies of scale through corporate-wide standardization and benchmarking. A definition focused on this aspect of global sourcing is proactively integrating and coordinating common items and materials, processes, designs, technologies, and suppliers across worldwide purchasing, engineering, and operating locations. p. 304. The global sourcing of goods and services has advantages and disadvantages that can go beyond low cost. Some advantages of global sourcing, beyond low cost, include learning how to do business in a potential market, tapping into skills or resources unavailable domestically, developing alternate supplier/vendor sources to stimulate competition, and increasing total supply capacity. Some key disadvantages of global sourcing can include hidden costs associated with different cultures and time zones, exposure to financial and political risks in countries with often emerging economies, increased risk of the loss of intellectual property, and increased monitoring costs relative to domestic supply. For manufactured goods, some key disadvantages include long lead times, the risk of port shutdowns interrupting supply, and the difficulty of monitoring product quality. With regard to quality in the food industry, see Roth et al. 2008. International procurement organizations, or IPOs, may be an element of the global sourcing strategy for a firm. These procurement organizations take primary responsibility for identifying and developing key suppliers across sourcing categories and help satisfy periodic sourcing requirements of the parent organization. Such setups help provide focus in country-based sourcing efforts. Particularly in the case of large and complex countries, such as China, where a range of sub-markets exist and suppliers span the entire value chain of a product/commodity, such IPOs provide essential on-the-ground information. Over time, these IPOs may grow up to be complete procurement organizations in their own right, with fully engaged category experts and quality assurance teams. It is therefore important for firms to clearly define an integration and scale-up plan for the IPO.
Thanks, Nina. Thanks, all. We'll have our seats. Our topic is the modest topic of navigating global volatility. Heaven knows there's more than enough to talk about. We have the whole world to cover and not enough time in which to cover it, but we're going to do our best. And we have a fabulous group of people to help us with it. Honestly, we could start anywhere. We could start anywhere but what's in the news lately. Among other things, let's start with the refugee situation in Europe. And KT, I'm going to start with your views on this, because in this country and in many parts of the world other than Europe, we read about it happening and it sounds terrible and so forth. But I think a lot of us don't appreciate the magnitude of the crisis for the European Union. Tell us what the threat is and what the future looks like.
Thank you, Jeff. What a small topic.
Yeah.
Let's start with a very positive sentence. It's the deepest crisis Europe has probably faced in the last couple of decades. And one that goes way further than the financial crisis we have seen during the last couple of years. And its impact question, in my very opinion, some of the core elements we have gained since the 1950s for the construct of the European communities and the European Union. And the component which makes it so hazardous at the very moment is the emotional component, because it leads to a multiple scenario of mutual finger pointing, maybe on the domestic level, currently in Germany, which is really worrisome. On the European stage, where Poland blames Germany for opening the gates without ever talking about any limits, for Germany blaming Hungary for building fences that would contradict elements of gained peace in the wider European region, Austria blaming Germany, Germany blaming Austria. At the same time, we have border controls. We are questioning one of the core freedoms, which was the freedom of movement. And we also see a dramatic lack of leadership in the European Union, who would first of all address the things in a way that the population in Europe would say, let's try to resolve it, and not only to find battlegrounds in that very thing. So what worries me is that now we are in a situation that in the European Union, the wonderful idea of solidarity that was already questioned, had been questioned in the financial crisis, is now even more endangered. And if the next Greek scenario pops up, or Portuguese, or Spain, or Irish, name it, you won't find the partners you need to resolve it in the way we have resolved a couple of things. So, a lovely start for that morning, but that's where we are. Let me just end this introductory remark with some semi-positive note.
Yeah.
It could also lead to a cathartic momentum, that we finally come to terms with some of the founding myth and even founding lies of the European idea, where we always dreamt of a Europe of equals. And we finally have to face realities, concentric circles, different speeds, but also find solutions that are reflected by the European treaties. And that's something that could end in something positive.
Ian, what's your view?
I'm with them until the last sentence. I mean, you got to keep in mind that this is just starting. Only 6% of the refugees from Syria, the 4.3 million that we've seen so far, have actually made it to Europe, with the exception of Turkey. And of course, the Europeans don't really consider Turkey Europe. And that number is going to go way up. And by Merkel basically saying, you know, you're here and we're prepared to accept very large numbers, it's something you have to be impressed with her leadership on the issue. But there's no ability either to integrate them culturally in Germany. There's no willingness, social willingness, and of course other countries aren't with her. So I think this is an unfettered disaster for what it means to be European. Even though economically, you know, the demographics would be beneficial to the German economy and to others. A couple of I absolutely agree with KT that the implications, the ability to respond and be resilient to the next crisis that comes along becomes harder. I think that the likelihood of Brexit goes up. I also think the likelihood that the Europeans, one thing that comes naturally from this is the transatlantic relationship is weaker now than we've seen it in decades. At any point since the Cold War, you see Xi Jinping going to Britain and the Brits saying, we want to be the best friends in the West of the Chinese. There is no special relationship anymore. It's really not, it's not on the table. The Brits see themselves as a country that needs to focus, you know, sort of as a mid-sized country on their own issues, not in being close to the United States. And also, I suspect, with the Russians playing the role they are now in Syria, that over the next 6-12 months, as it becomes apparent that if you want any resolution, if the Europeans want resolution, that must go through Moscow, that the gap you see between the Europeans and the Americans on sanctions against the Russians is going to grow, and that will help, of course, the Russian markets, but it will deepen the divide that we see between the United States and the Europeans.
Well, Mohammed, within minutes here, we have gone from the European refugee situation to involving also the transatlantic relationship between Europe and Britain and the United States, to involving Putin, to involving the Middle East. If you take a really big picture look at this situation, as it regards markets, where do you come out?
The most interesting thing is that after you listen to us today, when we look at economies, policies, social issues, politics, geopolitics, and then try to translate this to markets, there'll be a complete disconnect. You look at markets, we reached another high yesterday in the stock market. Volatility is very low. Basically, markets are telling you everything is fine. But when you look at fundamentals, they are signaling something very, very different. And the way you reconcile these things is very easy. Markets are focused on liquidity, and they're getting lots of it. They're getting lots of it from central banks. They're getting lots of it from companies that had accumulated massive cash coming out of the crisis and now are being forced to put it back into the system, but they're not investing in factories. They're basically investing, either giving it back directly to shareholders through equity buybacks and dividends, or M&As. So markets are completely hooked on liquidity, and they're saying all this other stuff is really interesting. I really appreciate what you're saying, but that's not how I'm going to make money right now. Right. That's not going to last forever. Okay, at some point, you're going to have to reconcile fundamentals down here and markets up here. Either the fundamentals improve and validate the markets, or the markets come down. If I may, a word on Europe, because there's an amount of pessimism. And let me take the perspective of a naive economist.
Yes.
Naive economists look at supply and demand and what equilibrates it. Supply is very, very high and will continue to be high, and you cannot control easily the supply of refugees coming across. Right. As a number, in October alone, the amount was almost as much as all of 2014. Right. And as you said, it's not finished yet. So you have a supply problem, excess supply, and you have a demand problem that neither at the national level, even Germany, right, the numbers are so large that it doesn't have demand for all that supply, and certainly not at the regional level. And you have nothing that clears that market. You don't have a price that clears that market. So you're going to have major disruptions in the short term. Integration issues are going to be important. The pressure they'll put on the political system are going to be huge, et cetera, et cetera. So I wouldn't want to downplay the short-term issues. Right. But if you go beyond that, if somehow the political system can step up to managing the short term, suddenly the long term, you start addressing problems that have dragged Europe down. Demographics you address. Right. A lot of this population coming across is actually educated. Europe has a massive problem where the people who have the wallet to spend, Germany, don't have the will to spend. Well, you know what? They're going to spend about 90 billion euros on this. So it's going to force Germany to be more expansionary. Actually, Europe needs that. Europe needs a more balanced aggregate demand. So if somehow you can manage the short term, you have the potential for making Europe better off. And I think that's really important, and that opportunity must not be completely forgotten when we look at the short-term challenge.
It's a very good point, because before leaving Europe, I want to get the views of Ian and K2 on this. Because what you're describing is a situation that potentially threatens the union itself. I mean, we saw in the Greek situation that the financial union isn't as much of a union as everyone had hoped and sort of pretended it was. And now we're just being reminded that culturally and governmentally, it's just not as much of a union as we had thought and hoped. Can this deteriorate to a point where the union itself starts to fray?
It's certainly, and I think this plays off of what KT was saying at the beginning, what it means to be the union, I think, is going to change a lot. It's going to be much more lowest common denominator. The aspirations for the common values, the social contract, just go away. Let's keep in mind that France had their 9/11 in the last 12 months with the Charlie Hebdo attacks. Turkey just had their 9/11 a few weeks ago with the terrorism. The Dutch, of course, had their 9/11 with the shoot down of MH17. These are not coincidental things. This is the geopolitical environment coming to roost in Europe in a way that's very proximate, and in a way that we're not going to feel at all in the United States, because this part of the world is so much more politically insulated, geopolitically insulated. You think we're only going to see 3 of those in the next 12 months? We're going to see a lot more of that. The one place I will take issue with Mohammed is most of the Syrians coming over are not particularly educated. That's not been true of previous migrations that you've seen. And it's going to be very hard to bring them into these societies. I think they're going to fail at that. And I think that when you see the radicalism that grows, when you see the hate crimes, we've already seen bigger demonstrations. We've seen a lot of violence just in the last few weeks. This is going to grow. I'd love to take the positive medium-term view, because clearly there's a lot of economic reasons. There's a lot of resilience in the institutions that are European. But I think the trends for Europe over the next few years from a geopolitical perspective are overwhelmingly negative.
Right. So Ian, the question I have to ask him is, I agree with what you just said, but can the political system respond? So if it looks at an equation that looks really negative in the short term, and possibly positive in the long term, right? And it's a given. They cannot control this issue. So the question becomes, do you believe the political system can step up to the challenge, or will the political system fail completely?
Can I step in, as having been part of that, been under that circus tent for a while? The problem is, I entirely agree with your stock taking. But the problem is we are stumbling from one necessary short-term solution to the next necessary short-term solution. And their dimensions are intertwined, yes, and it's necessary also to understand the interconnecting lines. But you need a short-term solution for 1.3 million, probably 1.3 million refugees, highly uneducated, by the way, in Germany this year. You need a short-term solution of how to deal with Austria. You need a short-term solution of what happens if we have our German Charlie Hebdo, which is only a matter of time until that happens. We have been lucky so far. You will need a short-term solution for energy prices that might be affected of it. You need a short-term solution for this and this and this and that. And at the same time, you have a construct of the European Union which is constantly somehow involved or somehow affected by here an election, there an election, there an election, there an election. So you are dealing with a patient on the operating table where you have 28 very distinctly talented doctors standing around this operating table. Right. And once in a while, someone is stumbling over the plug of the heart lung machine. Right. And then the patient groans, and then they would put the plug back into the wall, and everyone would be happy the patient's still alive. Right. But again, another short-term solution. And this conflicts with what I've said before, that you don't see people right now in Europe on top of the institutions, on the national level, who would also be willing to not be re-elected for a certain step forward. And that's something which is also another breeding ground for growing nationalism in countries where you didn't dream of growing nationalism so far. Look at the latest Polish elections. Look at, those are things which are not leading to a stronger Europe.
So you have a chief doctor who so far hasn't been willing to step up to that responsibility because of all of historical reason, but that has incredible standing among the other doctors in the room.
But your question, Mohammed, was, is there going to be a political solution when you know that there needs to be? And the answer is there will be political responses that will be effective, but they won't be European. They'll be at individual state levels. And Viktor Orban in Hungary has made a political response. He was isolated. He's become effectively an authoritarian within democratic Europe. You're going to see so much more of that. Right. And look at the Turkish elections. Nobody thought that you'd have an AK party majority government. And yet, you know, if there's a choice between human rights and liberal institutions or a strong hand of Erdogan in this environment, you get the strong hand. You're going to see that so much more across many of these European nations.
The chief doctor was never very happy of having been perceived as a chief doctor. Right. out of what you've said, out of historic reasons, but also...
By the way, there may be people wondering who the chief doctor is that you're talking about.
That's my former boss. So Angela Merkel is, I think, was a fantastic leader for Germany in years when Germany needed to step into some new responsibilities. But she was highly overtaxed over here in her perception of being a leader. Yeah. She's a different kind of leader. She's someone who would lead from behind, let things develop, and very often deal with ad hoc solutions necessary for the day, to manage the day. And she had opportunities in the last couple of years because the trust in Europe was high, that she could have pushed Europe into a certain, at least debate direction of the treaties, how the treaties, all the other things could be framed. It didn't happen. Some called her being Merkeliavelli. But that was more an art of hesitating vigorously as a success story than actually stepping forward. She did that in a great form. The Germans did play, I think, a quite good role. But all these things did not lead to a more united Europe.
That's right. And what we have to do here is move to another part of the world, because we got the whole world and we don't have enough time. So let's move to a completely other part of the world, to China. We've only mentioned the subject so far, but the issue of what China's ambitions are, not just economically, but militarily and diplomatically, as we've talked about relations with the rest of the world. There's a lot going on, and most of us as outsiders who don't devote our lives to this are really puzzled by what the larger picture is in the mind of Xi Jinping. And Ian, I'll start with you. How can we think of this?
As negative as we've just been about the environment in Europe, we have to recognize that in the last several days, the Chinese have hosted a breakthrough summit with the South Korean president and the Japanese prime minister. The Japan-China relations are normalizing. The great thing about Asia right now is some of your most important leaders, Abe, Xi Jinping, and Modi, all have enough popularity domestically that they can actually take on a lot of these long-term strategic economic issues, some successfully, some not so successfully. But it certainly means they don't want to play the nationalist card the way all of these European leaders now are doing. And I think that means the geopolitical environment in Asia is going to be less tense, not more. Having said that, the South China Sea is a real issue. The Chinese are testing the waters. The Americans are escalating as well. There are some countries in the region that, you know, they want more U.S., like the Philippines and Vietnam. And I think that we're going to see them get caught in the middle, and there will be market implications there. I don't think that's going to lead to a blow-up fight between the Americans and the Chinese. I think both can escalate in a constrained way. The way the Chinese are going to be a threat in the near term is that they're the only country writing meaningful checks internationally. The U.S. may give $1 billion of aid, 1.5 to Israel, maybe 1 to Afghanistan, but the Chinese are going to spend $1 trillion in infrastructure around the world, and they have commercial demands that are being made on those governments that will align them more with Chinese standards, Chinese SOEs, and it will break apart the Americanization and globalization that had been overlapping. That, for me, is one of the biggest drivers of political risk for multinational corporations that we see in the world today.
Mohammed.
Let me add to that. I always think of China as basically where you come out on 3 basic issues. First issue, it is an emerging power that is fueled by economic success, and that's not going to go away anytime soon. And history tells you that by definition, almost, emerging powers are disruptive. They're disruptive to the existing system. So yes, there's going to be tension. Yes, they're going to start creating multilateral institutions like the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank because they cannot reform the existing institutions. Yes, there are going to be disruptions. That should not be a question. The question is, are these disruptions that can be handled in an orderly fashion? I believe yes. Second issue, when you go through what China has gone through, it is not a smooth process. They have their own problems internally. They have financial issues. Like us, they overinvested in a social goal. So we, 10 years ago, believed that home ownership was a good social thing, that it enhanced the integrity of society. And we overinvested in housing. We made financing available easily, prices went up, and we ended up with a financial crisis. They have made the same mistake. They believed that owning equity in a broader fashion would mean that there'll be more support for pro-market reforms. And they ended up with their own bubble, which they're going to have to handle. So China is going to have all sorts of question marks about its ability to handle financial excesses. Third and most important thing to remember is there's a fundamental difference between how we view China and how China views itself. Mm-hmm. When we view China, we say you are either the second largest or already the largest, depending on how you measure economy in the world. You have global responsibilities. The Chinese says, what are you talking about? Look at our per capita income. Our per capita income is nowhere near the top 50 in the world. We have a national responsibility. When our per capita income goes up to the top 20, come and talk to us about global responsibilities. Right. In the meantime, from a per capita income side, we are still not focused on our global responsibility as much as we think we should. That is a fundamental difference of view, and that is why there's going to be tensions all along. If you believe all three things get resolved well, then China becomes again an engine of growth that facilitates adjustments elsewhere. And it matters for Germany, it matters for lots of countries. Right. If, however, one of these things trips them up, then the global environment looks really different.
Right. I have also rather limited concerns, and I can only build up on what has been said already in this regard. Whenever I'm over there, they're talking about their domestic issues, and they would always connect it to I would bring up where I see China in an interesting, sometimes questionable role on the world stage. One thing we have to recognize is that there are more and more sophisticated and savvy players in certain areas around the globe. They are also getting more involved in Europe, in business terms, but also politically. They do it often indirectly, and they learn a lot. And they also learn that there are opportunities the weaker and the less coherent our foreign policies are. Maybe from Washington, maybe in Brussels there is no foreign policy, but domestically in Europe, on the paper of course there is, and using opportunities. And still forming alliances, sometimes short-term, sometimes longer alliances, which, yes, contradict our interests here and there. And Iran is for them another partner than it would be for us, for instance. And that, again, has impacts on any resolution in the Middle East, on any question how the refugees will develop in the future. So, again, it's intertwined with each other. But at the end of the day, I don't see them as an aggressive player stepping up, trying to flex the muscles to a point that they rip and that's something with them. The only thing we should keep in mind is an accident. And in the South China Sea, if an accident happens, but that's what's being called euphemistically over here as a black swan. And
I'm going to invite questions and comments here in just a minute. There's a hand right there. Let's get a microphone over there if we can.
Jeff, good morning.
Morning.
Nathan Rosenberg from Insigniam. I'd like to go back to Europe, if that's okay.
Sure.
Russia's eaten off a piece of Georgia. As Bob Gates said, Crimea is gone. Eastern Ukraine is gone. At what point do we stop feeding the crocodile in hopes that we're eaten last? And what happens when Russian troops go into one of the Baltic nations to protect ethnic Russians?
That won't happen. No. So the last point, I really don't expect. Do we feed the crocodile, or are we in a situation now that the crocodile finds all the food it needs? Right. And the move towards Syria was, of course, due to our weakness to deal with that situation, but is a multiple win situation for Russia at the moment as well. It's not only a footprint in the region, they are on the level when it comes to how to ignite or somehow tame the refugee crisis in Europe. By the way, it's only the first refugee crisis. The next is the climate change refugee crisis, and so on and so on. They are building interesting energy alliances with Iran. They are a player right now where they could say, well, I'm just waiting until the Europeans come to me, to the Kremlin, and whether they sit there bare-chested or not, I will just ask them, could we just find a connection to eastern Ukraine? So those are things where someone who is still endangered to be ousted in Russia, with a couple of more tokens in his hands, and where he will probably connect some of the points which don't seem to be connected as such. Why not the Baltics? If you still have so many regional goods for your foreign policy strategy where NATO is not directly involved, you could still move all the way to Moldova if you want to. Why would you actually risk a clash with NATO? There's no reason for him. So cynically, he has a couple of years to maneuver rather freely. And I don't see any NATO member doing anything at the very moment if he would tighten the grip around Moldova.
Yeah, Ian.
Yeah, I mean, I completely agree. I think that it's very obvious that neither the Europeans nor the Americans care an awful lot about Ukraine. And furthermore, it's a much more multipolar environment or non-polar environment. And the Chinese are doing much more business with the Russians after the American sanctions. It's not like the Americans are going to put sanctions on China. So for those people that are saying we should be doing more against the Russians, you say, well, exactly what would you suggest and how would it be effective? And I've not seen a Democrat or Republican candidate that's actually been credible on that. I do think we have to ask ourselves, what did Putin gain in southeast Ukraine? He's not taking more territory even there, though many expected a land bridge with Crimea, Mariupol, important port, precisely because the people there are so strongly opposed to the Russians right now, and he doesn't want to take significant casualties at home. The costs to Putin economically over the medium and long term of paying for Crimea and southeast Ukraine are actually very significant, and he's going to have to bear them. I mean, you know, in terms of things that he's successfully stolen, I'd focus more on the New England Patriots Super Bowl ring than I would on Crimea and southeast.
Here, please.
Good morning. This is Sudhir Mehta from Pinnacle Industries in India. We are kind of at the third day of this conference, and one of the things that we are hearing this morning is that the world continues to be a very, very volatile place, and there is a lot of these interplays which are happening. If you were to kind of have the benefit of a crystal ball over the next 10 years, do you overall see the world to be a more peaceful place in the next 10 years with higher growth, or are we now looking at a situation where you've got all of these contradictions happening between countries, these various forces? You spoke about the high degree of liquidity, but that's a game which has to end sometime. So as business leaders, what is the kind of world that you think, are we looking at a better world, or are we looking at a more conflicted world in the next 10 to 15 years?
Mohammed.
So I've just finished a book coming out in January that deals with that issue, okay? And it starts from the premise that has become very clear in this conference, that the world is being shaken from below and from above. So above, we've talked about unstable geopolitics, we've talked about non-traditional anti-establishment parties, we've talked about economies that cannot grow. You know, the crocodile is not that strong. Okay, you have to ask the question, how strong is that crocodile when you come back to Russia? So if you look from above, there are major fluidity. And we can't even predict with any accuracy what the Federal Reserve is going to do next month, right? So major fluidity on top. On the bottom, major fluidity, the empowerment of the individual through the combination of social media, mobility, has really changed things. Now you can disrupt industries coming from a completely different world. Airbnb knew nothing about hotels, right? And they can disrupt that. So you are living in a world that's being shaken from above and being shaken from below, and is being held together by experimental central bank policies. Okay? That is our reality today. Hypothesis. That road is going to end in the next 2 to 3 years. The pressure on central banks to maintain the system coherent is becoming more and more, becoming harder. Central bank effectiveness is going down. The unintended consequences of unconventional policies are going up. So, hypothesis, the current road is going to end. Where does it go? You're not going to like this answer. It's your typical, what the British call a T-junction. There are two very credible alternatives with equal probabilities. One is, everything you've heard here fundamentally disrupts financial stability, and suddenly the world is in a recession with the return of financial instability. But there's another world, which is, in my view, the policies that are needed, it's not an engineering problem, it's a political problem. And the question becomes, does the political system respond? So what does it mean to you? So in a T-junction, the worst thing for businesses is to be paralyzed. You see two very extreme outcomes, equal probability, you get stuck. So what do you need? You just need three things. You need to build internal resilience to be able to navigate the bad world. You need to have the optionality to change your business plans and tweak them as you get closer to the neck of the T. And then you need the agility to respond quickly. So I tell you, predicting where we're going to be, whether it's going to be a better world or a worse world, is really hard. But predicting what you need to navigate that world is a lot easier.
I'm going to go to KT and then you. Yeah.
I just would like to follow up here and ask the question and try to give a poor answer as well. On which political system will react or not react? And I think that will be a core element for how the next 10 years will look like. Is it a stronger multinational political system? Is it one which is even more fragmented, back to rather strong national and nationalistic elements? And I personally see still a movement towards that direction, although I don't like it, but Europe is just a core example for it. Is it a political system which is being fed by your lower level, by more and more impulses coming from borderless directions? All of those elements will play a role and will play a part there. And defining this and reading that correctly, I think, is one of the most significant things to read the markets correctly. And I'm not that far yet that I would say that we see in the next 10 years a formation of something new which creates more stability. I still think we will see all three elements fighting with their elbows as strongly as they can to gain or to keep their grounds. And this is why I come back to Europe. It's such an important example how this will be resolved, because as it reconnects to many of the other potentials and crises we see. So it's just one component where you will see a lot of clinging on traditions. And in the next 10 years, we don't see an entirely new generation of policymakers. Right. Some will be. But I'm still skeptical whether we will have something which we would call a new era of stability or something like that. I don't see that.
Ian?
The most important single development in the next 10 years that we can kind of project is that China will become the largest economy in the world. It'll overtake the United States. When that happens, they will still be poor. Right. They will still be authoritarian. And I think we can safely say they will still be state capitalist. Right. In other words, they will have dramatically different priorities and preferences in how the global marketplace is run than we do. And that doesn't make them evil. It doesn't even make them that problematic as an actor, but it does mean that the level of stability in global growth is going down, right? I mean, you can't, you have to focus more on resilience and less on growth in an environment where your largest economy is both so disruptive, but also so much more uncertain in terms of the risks that you're taking in that market. The final thing I would say is that I agree completely with Mohammed's T-function, but the question is, before you get to the T-function, we are entering this period of geopolitical creative destruction. We have to get from here to there. And there's a depth of volatility and conflict that we just haven't seen play out yet. Right. I mean, the fact is that things in Europe just aren't that bad. Things are still pretty comfortable. In Greece, there was no real violence. Right. You saw Golden Dawn was a fascist movement. It was basically torn apart. Pegida, they had the fascist movement in Germany. They had 20,000 people demonstrate last week. It's just not in the United States. We could care. We have an immigration debate in the U.S. It's about building a wall with Mexico. It's just, these aren't relevant questions yet, and the markets don't yet care. So clearly this has to get much more volatile and unstable over the coming decade before we can start to address which of the two outcomes for Mohammed is the T-function. My guess is that the T-function takes more than 10 years. Yeah. That's the real question, is timing.
Can we have a short question and a short answer?
Yeah, very short. So this morning we had the session on digital currencies. And with the blockchain, and this is a question to Mohammed, so let's assume we get a shadow economy with blockchain, so digital currency which are not controlled by national banks, and entrepreneurs like myself, you know, we don't wait, we move. So how is this all going to play out? Life insurance is already, if you ask me, at the end of its curve, probably a dead product. So how do you see the whole double society, public currency where politicians is having their last stronghold, which would disappear, and then the digital currency play out? Thank you.
So I go back to the empowerment of the individual means that whole areas are migrating away from the established order. You mentioned one, I can mention 20 of them. Okay, peer-to-peer lending, completely bypassing, right? So the empowerment on the individual means that we are going to have more and more non-institutional solutions come up. So you'll have content here, but the big platforms will remain here, right? And what's going to play out in the next few years is how does new content and existing platforms react? There's one world in which the existing platform crushed the new content through regulation, through everything else. I don't think that's going to happen. There's another world where the existing content becomes so strong that it completely overshadows the existing platforms. That is really hard to predict because the existing platforms have enormous, enormous advantages. So what you're going to see is the middle get filled out. Okay, that's what's going to happen. You're going to see more and more existing institutions couple with new content and start filling out the middle. That's going to be great for you because you're going to have a lot more opportunities available to you. Now, it's not going to be a smooth process. There are going to be accidents. And I go back. Okay, the biggest risks, and Katie said it, is either you get an unintended accident or you get a policy mistake. And we are vulnerable to both. But in terms of your answer, what you're going to see increasingly is existing platforms and new content merge together and fill out the middle of that distribution.
With my bad character, I call that a development from government to Googlement, although it's Google stands as a proxy for taking over more traditional elements of institutional responsibility into the hands of borderless, bottom-up communication and other skills. And I think, yes, that bears a lot of chances, but we will still face a rather significant amount of panic reactions coming from those where you take actually the strongholds away. And that's something that needs to be dealt with, and that needs to be somehow translated into strategies, maybe from a business perspective, but also from a political perspective. And there are fewer and fewer actually willing to do that.
Right. We're just about out of time, and in fact, what I'm going to ask you now is truly impossible. In a few sentences at most, what's going to be the biggest difference in the way business people in this room will see the world in the next, say, 5 years? How is it going to be most different from what we have grown to experience over our lifetimes up till now? Ian, you're the lucky guy who gets to start.
Well, you're right, it's hard. The United States and the Western Hemisphere will be seen much more as a safe haven than it is today, as the volatility of so many other parts of the world grow. That is a huge positive here. At the same time, the global environment, away from US-led standards, away from U.S. principles and a U.S. free market, is going to fragment and going to make the ability to choose international markets much more challenging. So even though that's where a majority of the growth is coming from, it's going to be harder for corporates to make that call.
To do. Mohammed?
Your customer base and your competitors will look more and more different from what you're used to. You're going to be disrupted from places that you never imagined. And you're going to have a growing amount of clients, customers, that expect to be treated very, very differently.
Katie.
And hold on. And you will not be able to manage that without a lot more cognitive diversity, with a lot more efforts to overcome blind spots, because otherwise you will continue doing what you're doing and you're going to become irrelevant.
I think you will be concentrating way more and in a way faster pace and rhythm on geopolitical events. And you will ask yourself probably in 5 years, how the hell did we manage it not to spend more time on the first huge cyber attack we have seen?
Right. Right.
And why didn't we find more control mechanisms or preventive or preemptive mechanisms for that?
Right.
And that's something which, again, is connected to the question of very fast appearing pop-up scenarios in the geopolitical world, and it's more and more driven by that factor.
I wish we had more time, because to hear from three brilliant people like this on such momentous issues is a real treat. I've got an announcement about the next thing that's coming up here, but first we need to say to Ian and Mohammed and Carl Theodor, thank you very, very much. Really terrific, really terrific.